Okay, so we're going to weave a header on the first part of our scarf, and you're going to remove it, but what that header does is it spaces the yarn back out in the same spacing that you have it in the heddle, because now we've tied knots and we've made these spaces. So first of all, I'd like to check my knots and make sure that they're nice and tight. I'm still happy with the tension. Make sure that you're still happy with it. And we have some bulky yarn. You can use something, it really doesn't matter. You just need to use something that you know you can remove later. So it needs to be smooth. You don't need anything fuzzy. And we've wound it onto a shuttle. And that's going to help us space out the threads. The other thing that you're going to be doing is you're going to be moving your heddle for the first time into up and down position. So you need to check that. I also like to check my apron rod because we want to make sure that when we wind on, it's not going to get hung up on the side of the loom. So we need to do a little housekeeping, I guess you call it, and just make sure that everything is good. We can go ahead and take off the rubber bands. We don't need those anymore. And we're going to move our heddle into the up position. And the tension on your loom holds your heddle in place. So you might need to adjust a little bit, and I like to adjust both front and back. And that's going to change at the beginning of your project because you're still working with the tension on the loom. So as long as that's good to hold your heddle up, you're good. And now you have an open shed. So the first pass, I always do up and from the right, and down and from the left. It's just a personal preference. You might be instructed to do something different in your pattern, and you might develop your own personal preference, but this is mine. So we're going to take the yarn, and we're going to leave a little tail on the right-hand side, and we're going to put it through that shed that you've created by up heddle. And we're just going to settle it and put it in down shed. And you can see that now this yarn is trapped, and we're going to start to space out your warp threads more evenly. So we can pass this through. And since this is going to be removed, we really don't have to be worried about whether it's pretty. But you don't want to leave a big loop on the other side. So just settle it and up shed. And you can start to see those gaps closing up. So up shed and pass the yarn through and settle it, down shed, and we're almost there. See how they're almost even? So we've gone from this big space to just a little space. So let's pass this through one more time. And settle it. And go to up shed. And I think we're there. So you can cut it. And what I like to do is I like to just tie these two in an overhand knot just so the tails are corralled. It's just a personal thing. And I'm going to trim them off so that they're about 3 inches long. Doesn't have to be even. So we're all the way even across here. So now I'm going to show you how to wind a shuttle, because this is the yarn that is going to be your scarf. And your shuttle, there's lots of different kinds. This is a stick shuttle. I don't use a boat shuttle. The shed on rigid heddle loom is not that big, and so a boat shuttle can sometimes get stuck. So I like to use a stick shuttle, and we're going to use again, we're using Yowza as our weft yarn, and we're going to wind a shuttle. You need to put a slip knot in your yarn, hook it over this little notch they put in, and you're going to wind it in a figure 8. And what that does is it loads the side of your shuttle instead of the top of your shuttle. Because if you did that, the yarn that's sitting on your shuttle would get abraded going through the shed, and your warp yarn would get abraded. And you don't want to do that because it makes it fuzzy and it can make it weak. So a figure 8 comes down and down and down and down, and it makes a cross over the edge of the shuttle. So the bulk of your yarn is sitting on the side. And you want a good amount, a good workable amount. You don't need tons because that, again, is bulk, and you don't need that. And you don't want just a little bit because then you're going to have more ends to weave in. So I'm just going to wind this on. And when you're done with one side, you can turn it over and wind the other side. So there you're loaded on one side, and you just flip it over and continue on the other side. And it's loading itself on the side. There we go. And just cut it off. That'll be enough for now. Okay, so we're in upshed, and we're going to be doing hem stitching on this scarf. So you need to leave yourself a tail that you're going to sew with. And you need approximately 3 times the width of your project to hem stitch it with. So you just leave yourself about a 30-inch tail. You're in upshed, coming from the right, and you want to run your yarn through your shed against the back of the heddle because that keeps you in the widest part of your shed. So you cut down on that abrasion. You're going to come through and leave that tail, and you're going to beat it. And beat is a term that is not something you want to take really seriously. You're going to place the yarn, but it's called beating. And you're going to go to downshed, and I'm just going to adjust this loom again because I want it to be a little tighter, because there should be a snap. You should feel it really settle in there. Okay, so you've got your tail, and this is really the first pick that you're going to be weaving on your scarf. And a pick is like a row in knitting. It's one of those 4-letter words that we provided you a list of in the glossary. There's lots of new words. You may not be comfortable with them, but you know, when you learned how to knit, you had a whole new language, and weaving is the same way. So coming back in downshed from the left, you're going to settle your first pick, and this is where people start to have issues. They get too tight or too loose, and you know, you worry about it, but we're gonna work with that. So come through your shed, and I like to run it, like I said, across the back. You can kind of hear it. And it keeps you from dipping down or catching threads. You want to make sure you've got enough yarn off your shuttle so you're not pulling it. So your pick comes through, your yarn comes through, and what I like to do is I like to hold it here at the edge and pull it through with my hand so that it sits at an angle. Because when you beat the yarn into place, the yarn has to go over and under the warp threads, and it can draw in. That's part of weaving. The shape of your scarf is going to be determined by how tight and how loose your edges are, and you want it to be nice and even. So we're going to hold it at an angle, and you're going to beat and go to upshed, and you can see that the yarn is placed, it's not drawing it in, and it's not sitting away from your outside edge in a loop. You don't want loops, and you don't want it to pull in. And this is where your hands have to learn. You have to learn your yarn. Each yarn is going to behave differently, and it might take a while to get used to it. So we're in upshed. I'm going to go through the shed again, across the back, hold it, pull it, leave it at an angle, and beat. Downshed. Now, we're going to be doing hem stitching, so I need to weave a couple rows because we need something to stitch into. So I'm going to come through again. Settle your pick. And you can undo it. If you're not happy with it, you can undo it. And we're going to hem stitch in neutral. So you need to put your heddle back in neutral. So in order to do your hem stitching, you're going to want to thread that tail that we left onto a tapestry needle. And what hem stitching does is it secures your weaving so that it can't come loose. It can be decorative, and it's just a nice way to finish a scarf. It's not necessary. In consideration of the number of warp threads that we have 90 warp threads, we're going to be doing 3 by 3 hem stitching. And the way that you start is you want to kind of secure this first pick to the first warp thread on your right. So I'm just going to come in and I'm going to kind of make a knot. So I go over that and under it and through the loop, and that's going to be a little knot at the edge of your work. We'll tighten it down. And then to do the hem stitching, you bring your needle under 3 warp threads, and you can see it here, and then you're going to count up 3 weft threads. That's why it's called 3 by 3. So you come under 3 and go up 3 and come out in that little square. And this is the first pass. So we'll pull that through. Then you come back and go under the same warp threads, the same 3 warp threads again, and over that tail. And pull it through, and it's kind of like a half hitch. And once you get going, it's a little easier, but this first one is kind of weird. So you're going to tighten that up, and you can see that you've got the yarn that you're working with is caught. And you want to tighten that up pretty good. Don't be, when you wash it, it'll get loose. So you want to tighten it up. Not super tight. So your next bundle of 3 is going to be under 3 and up 3. And come up in your work. Pull it, then go into the same spot, come up under 3 warp threads, and go over that yarn so you catch it. And you're going to work your way across. I'm going to tighten that up, in, under 3, up 3, come up in your work, pull it through, and then I hold it down here, under 3 and over your yarn, and it catches. So you're going to continue this all the way across. And there's lots of ways to do this. You can do 2 by 2, you can do 2 by 3, and some of it, is dependent on your project. So you want to follow the instructions if there are specific ones. You might decide that you like a certain one, and there's some really decorative ones. So we're coming to the end of our hem stitching, and we're going to finish it off with a knot, same as we did the other side. And the edge is a little different. You're going to come up in the space between the last and the second to last warp thread. You're not going to be able to go all the way over 3. So in this last one, you're just going to come up and then go off your work and over that tail and up and catch it. It's a little different, but it's basically the same. And then you're going to tie a knot like you did at the beginning to catch that last warp thread. And you're going to weave this in later. So you can just leave it. It's just going to sit there. You can cut it off so that it's not so long. And now we're going to go back to weaving. So we're going to go from neutral to up shed because we're coming from the right. And you might need to adjust your warp a little bit. Just make sure that it's tight to hold that steady. So we're coming up and from the right, and we're going to go across the back. And I'm going to show you a little bit more weaving because you want to get in the hang of beating gently and placing that pick and having even sides. You don't want it to draw in and you don't want to have loops. So this is where your hands are learning and you're learning your yarn. So you're going to pinch it and you're going to leave it at an angle and then gently place it. So you have a little space here because your hem stitching brings that in. And you're going to continue. I'm going to continue weaving a little bit, and I want to show you what you don't want to do. And it really is just gently placing that yarn. And if you're not happy with it, say I wasn't happy with this, you can go back and undo it and resettle that so that you're happy with it. So what we're looking for is even weave. We're looking for the same number of rows, picks of weft as we have threads of warp. And if you beat it too tight, you change not only the feel of the scarf, you change the color of the scarf. So let me show you. This is a sample that I wove that has all the mistakes. So if you beat the picks too hard and you're getting more picks per inch than you should to have a balanced weave, you're going to see way more of your weft and it changes the color. This one, you can see so much more of the warp, which is purple. And this one, you can see so much more of the weft because it's just packed in. You don't get to see any of the warp. And you want to beat evenly and you want to beat carefully. And you want to leave a square of air between each row, between each pick. So place your yarn, beat gently, and what you're looking for is an even amount of yarn running north and south and east and west. So you want to place that pick, and let's talk about the edges. So the edges, the selvages of your scarf. Selvage is another one of those words in the glossary, and you hear weavers talking about selvages a lot. They can be the bane of your existence. People find it difficult to get their selvages even, and that's what you want. So the edges of your scarf are your selvages. And if you leave too big of a loop, you'll get a loopy, uneven edge. It's not only not durable, it's not pretty to look at. And if you leave your edges too tight, your scarf is going to draw in and be kind of misshapen. And you run the risk of changing the color again there as well. If you beat unevenly, if you pull your heddle in a weird way, your fell line or your leading edge of your weaving can get really uneven and not straight. And it'll be overbeaten on one side and underbeaten on the other side. So we just want to go slow and easy, and your hands are going to learn how to do this. And we're going to continue. And like I said, if you're not happy, change it. And give yourself a little break. It takes a little bit to learn this. So we're going to continue, and then I'm going to show you how to measure your picks per inch and also your scarf as you weave along. It's important that you measure your picks per inch, because if you overbeat, you might run out of yarn and your scarf is going to be shorter than you anticipate. So you're using a 10 dent heddle. And that means you have 10 threads per inch, 10 warp threads. And what you're looking for is 10 picks per inch. So let me weave this one, and then I'm going to show you how to measure. Gently. I'm going to put it in neutral so we can measure. You're going to need a tape measure, and I like a soft one. And I'm going to measure in inches because we're talking about picks per inch and ends per inch. And you're going to want to put your tape measure down on top of your weaving and get it oriented so that you're going to count the threads that you've woven. And what you're looking for is 10. So I'm going to put this here and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 rows, 10 picks per inch. And that's what we're going for. And you might want to periodically check as you go along. You know, you don't have to weave this all at once. And you're probably not going to be able to. But you want to check periodically as you go along because, you know, maybe your kids are aggravating you and you might really crank down on the yarn. It's kind of like knitting. Sometimes you get anxious and you knit tighter, and sometimes maybe you've had a glass of wine and you knit looser, and you can do the same thing in weaving. And like I said, it changes not only the texture of your weaving, it changes the color as well. So you'll be able to see it. Your shed starts to get smaller the more you weave. So you have to advance your warp pretty often. you don't want to have a small shed to work in, because then you're abrading your yarn. So I'm just going to keep weaving for just a little bit, and then I'm going to show you how to advance. When you make changes, do them slowly. Don't all of a sudden decide that you're too loopy on one edge and then bring that next pick in real tight, because then the change is really noticeable. So if you find that you're getting a little loose on the edge, try and tighten it up a little bit and kind of bring it back into line. Don't make the change real abrupt. So I'm going to settle this pick and put my heddle in neutral, and then we're going to advance the warp, and I'll show you how to measure that. I feel like I need to advance the warp now. I'm going to advance it again a little later on so I can show you how to put in the warp separators again, because that's going to keep your work nice and even. But to advance your warp so that you have more room to work, you want to put your heddle in neutral, and you're going to want to work the back ratchet. You're going to have to let it loose. You're going to have to undo it so that it's free, and you're going to move it forward, let it loose, and then kind of catch it again, and then you're going to crank it on the front. So now you have all this room to work. You're going to tension it at the back as well. I like to use both. And you're going to want to bounce your hand on your work, because you don't want it to be banjo tight. You really don't. There's no reason for it. But you do need some tension. It helps keep things even. So I'm going to tighten up both, and I'm happy with that. So now I'm going to continue weaving, and then I'm going to show you how to measure your work, because the next time we wind on, we're going to lose sight of this. You're going to lose sight of the scarf as you weave it. So in order to keep track of how much you've woven, you need to measure, and I'll show you that after I've woven a little bit more. So let me show you what to do when you run out of yarn on your shuttle. And I'm going to demo this as if I've run out of yarn. So I'm just going to cut it and show you what to do. So as you come to the end of your yarn, you're going to have a tail. And I'm in downshed, and I'm going to weave this tail in. So I'm going to put it into my work, into the shed, and I'm just going to pull it down to the back of the work and just let it dangle. And I'm going to leave it at an angle. And you can trim this off. I'm going to wind another shuttle, and we're going to pretend that I've wound another shuttle. And I'm going to come into the same shed. Now there's more than one way to weave in your ends, and this is just one of them. This maintains the rhythm of up from the right and down from the left. And sometimes that's important to your pattern. Sometimes you can join new yarn in different ways, but for the purposes of this scarf, we're going to do it this way. So you're going to wind another shuttle, and then you're going to come into that same shed, down shed, from the same side. And your tails are going to overlap just a little bit. So you're going to look at the bottom threads of your shed, and you want to overlap by 3 or 4. So you're going to find that place, and pull that yarn for the new shuttle down to the back of the work. And you can see that I'm overlapping by 3 or 4. I think I've got 4 there. And you're going to leave that, you're going to leave a tail, and you're going to leave that at an angle, because we're just going to close our shed and beat. And go to up shed, and you've got this little overlap. And I'm going to tighten that up a little bit by pulling on that one. You can make adjustments on the fly. And we're going to beat again just to settle things nicely. And that's how you join a new shuttle. Then I'm just going to continue . And then I'm going to show you how to measure and advance your warp again. So as you can see, it's getting time to advance my warp. You can see this shed getting smaller, and each time you weave a pick, it gets a little smaller. And the smaller it is, the more you're rubbing the yarn. So that's all the space you have, which is why I run it against the back of the heddle to be in the biggest space. And before we advance the warp, let me settle this. I'm going to take care of these ends, because they can get tangled up from where we join the yarn. They can get tangled up as you wind on, so you kind of want to trim those off. So I'm going to show you how to measure the total length of your scarf. And you're going to do this before you advance so you don't lose your beginning. You're going to want to measure from the beginning, and when we advance the warp, it's going to disappear. So we've got our heddle in neutral, and you're going to measure what you've woven so far from your hem stitching. And then you're going to put a removable stitch marker on the edge of your scarf. So we've got, let's see, 5 inches to right here. And this is where your notebook comes in handy, because you're going to want to keep notes of how you started the scarf and how much you've woven, so you don't lose track. Believe me, I've done hem stitching at the beginning and forgotten to write it down, and then when I got all the way to the other end of the scarf and all of this is wound on, and I wondered, did I hem stitch? So you really need to keep track of things. I love to have a notebook. So we're going to mark this with a stitch marker, a removable stitch marker. From here to here, we've got 5 inches. And here's the stitch marker. And this is just going to ride along as you go. So that was about where we were with 5 inches. And that's just going to kind of live there. And while we're here, here's where we join the yarn. It's really nice and unobtrusive. And we're going to want to write that down in our notebook, 5 inches of weaving. And now we're going to advance the warp. So we're in neutral, and we're going to loosen up our back beam. Let that come forward. And as we roll this on, we're going to watch those tails, and you're going to trim those off completely when you wash your scarf, after you wash your scarf. And we're going to wind on. Okay, now we're going to need our paper, because as we wind it on, we're going to protect our weaving from getting distorted from the knots. So we're going to feed this underneath. we're going to be careful of those ends. We don't want to wind those in. Catch the paper. So you want to be mindful of the ends so they don't get caught because they'll pull your weaving. You just want to keep an eye on them. And you're going to retension. Okay. Make sure everything's good. So you can see now your shed's nice and big. Got plenty of room to come through there. We're actually going to be in down shed for this pick. And there's nice tension on the loom. So you've got a nice big shed to come through. And you're just going to continue weaving. You're going to want to make sure that when you join, you make it nice and neat and tidy. You want to trim those ends and keep track of them. Every time that you advance the warp and you need to continue measuring, you're going to measure from your safety pin, your stitch marker. You're going to measure up and reposition the stitch marker and write it down in your notebook. So you're going to continue weaving, and you can take a break. Let me show you what to do when you take a break. So what I do when I leave the loom is I like to take the tension off a little bit, but I also like to store my shuttle in my weaving. So you can put it in the shed and then move your heddle into neutral, and it holds it nice and neat and tidy. And you can actually hang this up on the back of a door if you want to, on some hooks. You just leave the tension nice and gentle, and you can walk away. But I want you to continue weaving. We're going to weave all the way to the other end. You've got 72 inches to weave, so you've got lots of practice. It's going to be fun. You might make some mistakes. You can correct them. And when we come back, I'm going to show you some finishing.